Your teeth hurt. Not occasionally now, but constantly. The molars on your left side are gone wore down from a lifetime of grinding seeds and bone. The remaining teeth are loose, moving slightly in their sockets. Eating is painful, so you're eating less, which means you're weaker. Your vision has deteriorated. You can see shapes clearly up close, but the world beyond 30 feet is a blur. Your knees ache when you walk, and you can't run. You know this because you tried yesterday when the group spotted a boar, and by the time you reached the hunting party, they were already deciding whether the animal was worth pursuing. They looked at you approaching, saw you couldn't move fast enough to help, and continued without you. No one said anything. No one had to. You understand the calculus. You're a net consumer of resources now. Your ability to hunt, to gather, to defend the group, to contribute meaningfully to survival is declining. You have maybe 5 more winters left. If you're lucky, the group will feed you. Probably. The social bonds that kept you alive for 60 years still hold some weight. But you know how the story ends, and the knowing is perhaps worse than the ending itself. The mythology we construct around aging in modern society is one of inevitable decline, followed by medical intervention and eventual comfortable death. We assume that aging in prehistoric times was faster and harder, a brutal process where the old simply didn't last long. But the reality is more complex and far darker. Ancient humans who reached what we'd consider old age 60s, 70s, 80s faced a specific kind of suffering that modern medicine has almost entirely eliminated. They experienced the deterioration of physical capacity in a world where physical capacity was survival. They watched themselves become burdens while still conscious, still aware, still capable of thought and memory, even as their bodies betrayed them. They witnessed the beginning of their own obsolescence while the group continued forward, resources devoted to the young and strong. The darkness of prehistoric aging wasn't primarily the fact of death. It was the experience of becoming useless before you became dead. The demographic evidence from prehistoric populations shows that while average life expectancy was low, perhaps 30 to 40 years, this number is heavily skewed by extreme infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you had a reasonable chance of reaching 50 or even 60. The skeleton remains of individuals in the fossil record sometimes show signs of extreme age. The Lachapelok Saints Neanderthal, estimated to be in his 60s, survived with severe arthritis, missing teeth, and injuries that would have been completely debilitating. His survival suggests that his group cared for him despite his inability to contribute to the hunt. He was fed. He was sheltered. But what that caregiving actually looked like, what it felt like to be the recipient of charity in a world where resources were scarce, is something we can only infer. The care was pragmatic, probably not cruel, but not sentimental either. You're kept alive because breaking the bonds of kinship is costly, but that doesn't mean your presence is welcomed or your decline is mourned. The physiological changes of aging in prehistoric contexts were probably more dramatic and more painful than in modern times. Dental disease became progressive and irreversible. Teeth wore down from grinding food, from the sand and grit that was part of every meal. Once a tooth broke, it exposed the nerve. Infection could follow. Abscesses formed. Bone was lost. The archaeological evidence shows that many elderly individuals had extensive tooth loss. The consequence was malnutrition. You can't properly chew fibrous foods. You can't process foods efficiently. Your nutritional intake declines even as your body needs nutrients to maintain itself. You enter a slow decline where each year, you're slightly weaker, slightly more vulnerable to infection, slightly less capable. Meanwhile, the younger members of the group are eating the best foods. They're the hunters, the fast runners, the ones who bring down game. They're the reproductive potential of the group. Resources naturally flow toward them. The elderly are maintained, probably, but maintained on the margins. Arthritis and joint degeneration appear in ancient skeletons with increasing frequency in older individuals. The wear and tear of a lifetime of physical labor walking, hunting, gathering, building shelter accumulates in the joints. By your 60s, your knees probably hurt constantly. Your back is degraded. Your shoulders have limited range of motion. In a world where mobility is survival, where you need to be able to move quickly and carry loads, arthritis is functionally catastrophic. You can still contribute to settlement-based activities. You can work on tool making, on hide processing, on food preparation that doesn't require gathering. But you're slow. You're painful to watch. Younger people have to take up the work that you can no longer do. The resource cost of maintaining you increases as your contribution decreases. The cognitive changes of aging in prehistoric contexts are under-discussed but probably significant. Some people experience cognitive decline in old age. Dementia, memory loss, confusion. In modern society, we have institutions to care for people with severe cognitive decline. In prehistoric societies, an elder with advanced dementia becomes a serious burden. They can wander off. They can create conflict within the group. They can eat resources without contributing. The treatment of such individuals was probably pragmatic. Some groups apparently abandoned elders who became severely cognitively impaired. There's evidence of this in some ethnographic accounts from recent hunter-gatherers. An elder who can no longer care for themselves and whose cognitive decline makes them dangerous might be left behind when the group moves. Not as explicit murder, but as a withdrawal of support that everyone understands will result in death. The elder is given food for a few days. Then the group leaves. What happens after that is not explicitly the group's responsibility. The question of how elderly individuals actually experience their own decline is almost impossible to answer directly, but we can infer from the psychology of aging in modern populations, with the assumption that the basic emotional and cognitive apparatus was similar. You're losing capacities you've relied on for a lifetime. You're becoming dependent in ways you've never been. Your identity was built around being a hunter, or a gatherer, or a maker of tools. Now you're none of those things. You're past your reproductive prime. You're not attractive to younger members of the opposite sex. Your children are grown. Your grandchildren might not know you well. Your role in the group is increasingly as a repository of knowledge, a reminder of the past. That's significant, but it's also a fragile basis for continued inclusion. The moment your knowledge becomes less valuable than the resources you consume, the calculation shifts. Some evidence suggests that certain cultures developed specific roles for elderly individuals that partially offset the decline in physical capacity. The elder as keeper of knowledge, as storyteller, as mediator in disputes, as teacher of young people. In oral cultures without written history, the elder's memory is literally the group's archive. Information about where water sources exist in drought years, about how to make certain tools, about the genealogy and history of the group all of this lives in the elder's mind. As long as the elder is valued as a resource in this sense, their physical decline is partially tolerated. But this value is contingent. If the information is transferred to younger people, if the elder's memory becomes less reliable, if their teaching becomes less coherent, the value diminishes. And once the value is gone, the tolerance for maintaining someone who no longer contributes is limited. The treatment of women in old age probably differed from the treatment of men, though the evidence is limited. Postmenopausal women entered a different category, no longer reproductive, but freed from some of the constraints of reproductive years. Some evidence from ethnographic studies suggests that postmenopausal women sometimes gained status and authority in ways that younger women didn't. They could participate in hunting decisions, in major group decisions, in ritual roles that younger women couldn't access. But this increased status applied to women who could continue physical work, who could still gather and process food. A postmenopausal woman with severe arthritis had even fewer options than a young woman in the same condition. She lost the reproductive role that gave her value, but she couldn't access the increased status of older women because her physical capacity was too compromised. The evidence becomes visible in how different cultures handled end-of-life care. Among the Inuit, there's historical evidence of elderly individuals requesting death when they felt they were becoming a burden, and the group facilitating that death through various means. Not as murder, but as accommodation of an elder's request. The elder would walk out into the ice, or accept a dose of poison, or ask a family member to perform the killing. The death was framed as honorable, the elder choosing dignity over deterioration. But the voluntariness of the request is worth questioning. When resources are scarce, when you know your presence is a burden, when the group's survival depends on not allocating resources to those who can't contribute, how free is your choice to end your life? You're making a rational calculation within a system that incentivizes that calculation. The society frames it as choice. But it's also coercion. Just coercion operating through psychology rather than force. But interpreting the evidence requires acknowledging significant limitations in what we can actually know. The skeleton of an elder doesn't tell us how they were treated while alive, only that they survived to advanced age with significant physical limitations. The fact that they survived suggests their group had some capacity for tolerance, that kinship bonds held even when their contribution was minimal. But surviving to old age, often with significant pain and disability, might have been worse than dying younger. We're inferring too much about psychological experience from skeleton remains. We don't know what it felt like to be old in a prehistoric context. We're projecting our assumptions about how people must have experienced these conditions based on how modern people might experience them. Moreover, the emphasis on decline and burden might be skewing our picture toward negativity. Some evidence suggests that certain elderly individuals retained significant status and respect. Individuals who were successful hunters or gatherers early in life, who had numerous children, who had accumulated knowledge and prestige, such individuals might have continued to exercise authority even as their physical capacity declined. The group might have tolerated their presence because of their historical status and their continuing role in decision-making. A leader who can no longer hunt, but who makes strategic decisions about group movement and hunting strategy remains valuable. The decline in physical capacity doesn't necessarily correlate with decline in status or authority. But the individuals who retained status were probably the exceptions, not the rules. There's also evidence that some societies developed specific elder roles that were genuinely prestigious rather than marginalizing. The shaman role, a spiritual authority figure, was often performed by older individuals. The position granted status and allowed continued participation in group decisions even when physical capacity was limited. Ritual specialists, healers, storytellers, these roles were often filled by elderly individuals, and they were sometimes genuinely valued. The elder wasn't just maintained out of charity. They were maintained because their knowledge and authority served specific functions. But again, this probably applied to a limited number of individuals. Most elderly people probably existed in the margins, tolerated but not celebrated, maintained but not welcomed. The resolution of these conflicting observations is that prehistoric aging was probably varied and context-dependent. In some situations, elderly individuals experienced genuine respect and authority that continued despite physical decline. In other situations, they experienced marginalization and the slow withdrawal of resources. In some cultures, end-of-life practices were more accepting of assisted death than in others. The treatment of the elderly probably also varied based on resource availability. In years of plenty, maintaining elderly individuals was a minor cost. In years of scarcity, they became a significant burden. The group probably had flexible policies that shifted based on circumstances. A grandmother who was respected in good years might find her status declining in famine years. The support for her continued existence would decrease. The group would suggest, or directly state, that it might be better if she didn't continue consuming resources. What makes prehistoric aging especially dark compared to modern aging is the absence of hope for improvement. If you lose your mobility to arthritis in a modern society, you can use medications, physical therapy, mobility aids. You can reorganize your life around your limitations. In a prehistoric context, you can't. The decline is permanent. It will continue until death. You watch it happening. You feel it happening. You see the group's attitude shift as you become less capable. You know that your presence is increasingly an obligation rather than a benefit. And there's no possibility that this will improve. Medicine won't help you. Technology won't compensate. You're not going to learn new skills to offset your physical decline. You're going to continue declining until you die. That knowledge, that certainty, that absence of hope for anything better, that's probably what made prehistoric aging genuinely dark in a way that's difficult for modern people to access. Our aging involves suffering, but it also involves possibility, medical intervention, sometimes recovery. Ancient aging involved suffering with absolute certainty that the suffering would only worsen. What's worth sitting with is how much of the darkness of prehistoric aging persists in modern consciousness, even in modern medicine. We're terrified of becoming burdens. We're anxious about losing our independence. We're afraid of becoming unable to contribute. These fears have deep evolutionary roots. They come from a time when these outcomes meant death, when being dependent meant being abandoned. Modern medicine has removed the existential consequences. A person with severe dementia is maintained through institutional care, not left to die. But the psychological terror remains. We still feel the primitive fear of becoming irrelevant, of consuming resources without contributing, of being maintained through charity rather than valued for who we are. Our ancestors faced this as a genuine probability. You might not have been afraid of it because the fear wouldn't help. But you would have known it was possible, known it was likely, known that your continued existence depended on the group's willingness to maintain you. That knowledge shapes how you live every day of your adult life, because you're always aware that you're moving toward a state where you'll be dependent on others' goodwill.